Good afternoon and welcome to the Council of State Governments webinar on state responses to human trafficking. My name is Jeremy Williams. I am the Human Services and Public Safety Analyst with CSG's Southern Regional Office, also known as the Southern Legislative Conference, in Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us here today. We hope this webinar will provide some valuable information that may help you understand the trajectory we've seen states taking in an effort to combat this very serious crime that affects a wide range of individuals. You know, it's not merely an immigration issue. The U.S. Department of Justice estimates that at any given time, as many as 300,000 American children are at risk of becoming victims of human trafficking. It's an issue that affects mostly women and children, but men are not exempt from victimization, particularly regarding the threat of forced labor, which is the most common form of exploitation. There have been many cases, big cases in the news. I remember a case in 2003 involving a factory in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where 50 or so workers were brought from India. These were professionals, mostly engineers, I believe. Their documents were confiscated. They were confined to the plant, small sleeping quarters, weren't allowed to leave, given food rations. And when it was discovered this was going on, of course, it resulted in huge public outcry. And I think that's indicative of probably the most insidious aspect of this crime, which is that it often happens right under our noses and without our knowledge. This case in Oklahoma actually, at least in part, prompted legislation sponsored by then State Representative Marion Cooksey to make human trafficking a specific criminal offense, including penalties. It included a mechanism for providing restitution for victims, but perhaps most importantly, it sought to raise awareness about this issue with law enforcement personnel as well as with the general public. The legislation garnered wide bipartisan support and was passed in the legislature there in 2007. Representative Cooksey, along with State Senator Jenny Forehand from Maryland, spoke on this topic at the SLC's annual meeting in Oklahoma City in 2008. Some of you who attended that meeting may remember that session. Senator Forehand sponsored legislation in Maryland that created what I believe was the first state task force on human trafficking in the nation, which has proven to be an important policy decision because it allows states to assess how big of a problem human trafficking may be. But I did want to mention that a summary of that session is available on our website, along with a separate report on human trafficking in southern states I did in 2009. So the SLC has been tracking this issue for some time. Fortunately, much of the information in those reports is a little bit outdated because states have really taken the reins in combating this issue head-on in the last few years. Now, task forces, restitution for victims, decriminalization of prostitution for victims of human trafficking, which actually has proven to help tremendously with encouraging victims to come forward without fear of prosecution. These things have become the standard for state legislation, and I think we have here today a great panel to give us a picture of where states stand on this issue, as well as some explanations and examples of model policies which have been championed and supported by both Republicans and Democrats that are making our states safer places to live. Before I introduce the panel, I did want to mention to you that you, the audience, are in a listen-only mode. If you'd like to submit a question, please type that in the question box in the GoToWebinar toolbar on your screen, and you may do so at any time during the presentations. I'll field those at the end of the program. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible, but if we fail to get your question, we'll certainly make sure that it gets forwarded along to the appropriate presenter so that they may follow up with you at a later time. Also note that we'll be recording this event, and it will be available at the CSG website at knowledgecenter.csg.org. You can reach the Knowledge Center directly through CSG's website, csg.org, or directly at knowledgecenter.csg.org. And I believe you can look for it online by the middle of next week. It'll take us a few days to format and post it, but it should be available in a few business days. So we'll begin today's event with an overview of this topic and a look at federal laws, as well as a look at where states stand. To do that, we have with us Ms. Brittany Vanderhoof, who is the Policy Counsel with the Polaris Project, an organization that tracks and assesses the effectiveness of human trafficking laws. Ms. Vanderhoof has served with the Polaris Project since 2001 and is responsible for assisting both federal and state legislative efforts. In addition to outreach to advocates and policymakers, she tracks human trafficking legislation in all 50 states and in Congress. Next, we'll turn to a specific, state-specific look at this issue. We have with us State Senator Missy Irvin from Arkansas, who sponsored legislation there this year to, among other things, establish a statewide task force to focus on preventing human trafficking and raising awareness about this issue. Senator Irvin has been in the state legislature since 2011 and has been very involved with the various SLC committees, has been a great supporter of ours. She currently serves as the Assistant President Pro Tem and is chair of the Senate's City, County, and Local Affairs Committee, and is also the vice chair of the Joint Energy Committee. Finally, here to tell us a bit about the efforts being made in Georgia is Ms. Dahlia Racine, Assistant District Attorney with the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office. Ms. Racine heads up the Crimes Against Children Unit and is involved in the handling of human traffic cases for the county. In the past, she served with the Fulton County DA's office in their Crimes Against Women and Children's Unit. She has a great deal of experience investigating, preparing, and prosecuting child molestation, sexual assault cases, and has handled homicide cases with involving prostitution. I apologize for the brief introductions. Please know you can find full biographical information for each of our speakers through the links in the webinar advertisement, in your email, or on our website. We'll hear from all three speakers, then we'll have time for questions and answers from the audience. Thank each of you for being here. We look forward to your presentations. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Vanderhoof.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me and for that great introduction, Jeremy. I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about Polaris Project as a baseline. Polaris Project was founded in 2002. We're based in Washington, D.C. with a client service office also in Newark, New Jersey. We work to combat all forms of trafficking in the U.S. through a comprehensive approach. So we provide case management and assistance to survivors of trafficking, including job training, job counseling, and transitional housing. We also take the experience that we learn from our clients and put that into state and federal policy work. We also conduct training and technical assistance, and we also operate the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline. And what that hotline is it's the national hotline owned by the Department of Health and Human Services. We've been operating it since 2007, and what we've seen since then are calls from every state in the country, from areas where you wouldn't necessarily expect trafficking to be occurring. We actually just released our 5-year report, and in that report you can see trends of trafficking across the country, what type of different networks we're seeing, where victims are coming from, and sort of really looking at that issue of prevalence. So if you're interested, that is now available on our site. You can go ahead and next slide. Thanks. So that's what Polaris does. Just as an introduction, I wanted to sort of give a baseline idea of what the human trafficking is or what that definition looks like. What you'll see through the federal government and also through the states is that everybody defines the crime of human trafficking a little bit different in their criminal code. But almost all of them follow this basic structure, and this is just a way of breaking down the elements of human trafficking. We call this the AMP model. So in order to have a complete definition of trafficking, you need to have an action, you need to have a means, and then the purpose. The action is typically recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, or attempting. And the important thing to note here is that you don't need all of these. One is sufficient. One misconception about trafficking is that it must involve some sort of transportation, and that's not necessarily true. Someone can be trafficked in their own neighborhood or in their own city, but one of these actions is sort of sufficient to get you part of the way to a trafficking situation. The next section is means. So how is a trafficker getting labor or services from their victim? And it's through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. The one exception to this is when you're talking about children who've been sex trafficked. In most states, this requirement of showing force, fraud, or coercion is not required. The final piece is the purpose. So what is the reason for the actions of the trafficker, the controller? And it's for commercial sex acts when you're talking about sex trafficking, or for labor and services. And essentially, once you have sort of one from each box, you have a trafficking situation. Like I said, not all states are using the same words or using the same structure, but everyone sort of has these basic elements in terms of what makes up their definition of trafficking. You can go to the next slide. In order to sort of help states define trafficking in their state and also to implement related laws, there are a couple of different things that can be used. The Polaris project has been putting out a comprehensive model legislation guide since 2006. We're in the process of revamping it, so stay tuned, but our current one is available for use. The second piece of model legislation that is going to be becoming more increasingly useful is the Uniform Act on the Prevention of and Remedies for Human Trafficking. This was adopted by the Uniform Law Commission in July of this year. And what we see in the ULC Act is a focus on prosecution. So what should a trafficking law in a state look like? We see victim protections in the Model Act. So, making sure that victims are given the assistance and support that they need. And some examples of what we saw in the ULC is a recognition of immunity for minors, so that the idea that minors should not be prosecuted for prostitution offenses, vacating convictions, allowing victims of trafficking to have prostitution and related offenses removed from their record. Affirmative defense, so allowing trafficking victims to assert the fact that they were trafficked as a defense to criminal charges, and also posting of a state or national hotline. All of these specific provisions, as well as more, are found in the Uniform Act. When you look at the Polaris Project Comprehensive State Law, you'll see the elements of the Uniform Act plus additional things, including the creation of John schools and also a victim caseworker privilege. So anything that we are sort of seeing as trends in the states, language will be found in these model legislation. And anything that we don't have in the model legislation, we can usually point to a state that has done something similar or be pulling from the federal government. So there's a lot of assistance available to legislators who want to be working on a particular type of law in their state. Next slide, please. So what this shows is something that Jeremy touched on in his introduction, which is the fact that states have really taken up the issue of human trafficking as a state issue. The first states to do this did so in 2003, got off to a little bit of a slow start in 2004 and 2005, and you can really see the uptake in the number of states that have passed some type of trafficking law since then. It's taken us 10 years, but in 2013, we got all 50 states plus the District of Columbia to pass human trafficking laws. Wyoming was the last holdout, and we got them this year, which we were really excited about. And what we've seen is that states have not only adopted basic laws or basic criminal laws, but we've seen a lot of innovation, which I'm going to talk about later. And some of those innovations have become part of what we consider a basic framework. Essentially what we're seeing in the states is that so we see labor trafficking statutes in all 50 states plus the District of Columbia, and 49 states that have laws related to sex trafficking. Next slide. So part of what Polaris Project does is we created something what we call our state ratings map. And what the state ratings map does is it tracks the presence or absence of 12 different types of laws that we see as being necessary for a basic framework. And a lot of those laws that we see as now basic were innovations that we saw in states. For example, two of the types of laws that we track are safe harbor laws and vacating convictions laws. And those were types of laws that we saw start in New York and then be picked up by states like Illinois. And because they were so fundamental to protecting victims, and we saw so much interest in the states, that they were incorporated into a baseline response. So in addition to safe harbor and vacating convictions, the other types of laws that we consider as being fundamental are a basic sex trafficking statute, labor trafficking statute, authorizing asset forfeiture for human trafficking crimes, creating or expanding investigative tools for law enforcement. So that can look like incorporating human trafficking into the state RICO statute or gang predicate offense statute. This can also mean authorizing wiretapping in the state for human trafficking offenses. Training for law enforcement is a key part of making sure that the tools available are being used and are being used in an effective way. Task forces, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, are also key to making sure that a state has a coordinated response. Posting of a hotline, either a state or a national number in various establishments through the states, is a way of getting information to the general public and also a lifeline for victims seeking assistance. Making sure that no showing of force, fraud, or coercion is necessary when you're talking about the sex trafficking of a minor. So making it easier for prosecutors to prove those cases. Authorizing civil damages to trafficking victims. And then finally, creating a state victim assistance plan. Making sure that there are at least resources available for victims that could include state compensation funds or assistance offered by states. So what we're seeing is that those early states, New York, Illinois, Washington, sort of created their human trafficking laws piecemeal and sort of adopting one type of law at a time. And what we saw with the states that came later is that they've actually been able to adopt large comprehensive bills that incorporate the best practices into one big bill. So we saw that in Arkansas this year, and then last year we saw that in South Carolina. So some of the states that came a little bit later have been able to benefit from the experience of what we've seen in the states. And what's great is that states are still innovating and still sort of pushing the ball forward on what they can do to respond to this crime and hopefully also to prevent it. And we're actually seeing a little bit more innovation in the states than what we're seeing at the federal level, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But some of the emerging state practices that we've seen, sort of beyond just the aspects of the things that Polaris Project tracks on the state ratings map, is expanded training. So when we conceptualize of the state ratings process, we really focus on law enforcement. But what we're seeing in states is a recognition that training can't just stop with the police. It needs to go further. So in New Jersey this year, they passed a law that requires training for judges, prosecutors, relevant stakeholders within state agencies, and also hotel and motel employees. And what they saw in New Jersey was with the casino industry specifically, that there was a lot of trafficking occurring within the hotels. And so they wanted to make sure that employees were trained on what the indicators were so that if they did see something, they would have an idea of what it is and what they could do about it. What we saw in Kentucky this year was actually a really great expansion on the idea of safe harbor. So what safe harbor is it's a protection for children that have been commercially sexually exploited, which means any child engaged in prostitution should not be prosecuted or should at least be given an opportunity to be diverted from prosecution and also be offered services. What we saw in what we're seeing in most states is that this is related to prostitution offenses only. Kentucky advocates and legislators recognize that a lot of kids are not just charged with prostitution, but are being charged with related offenses such as loitering. And what that Kentucky safe harbor law did was it took all of those different related crimes into account when they drafted their safe harbor law. So it was great. They saw sort of the baseline measure, which is safe harbor, saw what was happening in other states, took information from the field, and then crafted a law that we sort of see as being groundbreaking. Another promising state practice was in Texas. So Texas was the first state to enact a hotline posting law. And what they did is they require states with, or the establishments with specific types of alcohol licensing requirements to post the hotline. And what we see is that Texas is a state where we receive the most amount of calls, which isn't surprising when you think about the location and population of Texas. But what was really fascinating was the fact that most people who were calling from, or the number one place people from Texas were seeing, were getting our number was from these hotline posters in these establishments. And so what that says is that if you can get hotline posters in the right place, you can see a response. And what happens when someone calls the hotline is if they're a victim in need of services, we can connect them to law enforcement if that's what they want, or we can get them connected to service providers. We can also do things like safety planning and just providing any sort of additional assistance the caller might need. Finally, what we're seeing in a state like California, what we're seeing in California are innovations in laws that are sort of really pushing the envelope forward and are actually starting to become models for federal legislation. So in California in 2010, they passed a law requiring companies that are doing over $100 million of annual revenue operating in the state of California must report on what they're doing, if anything, to eliminate slavery and trafficking from their supply chain. So this isn't a regulation in the sense that companies have to do anything other than report. So they're not required to inspect their supply chains. They're not required to do anything other than say what they're doing. But what we're seeing in California is that companies are really taking this up and creating sort of a best practices standard and creating sort of a gold standard for companies to be socially conscious and socially responsible in this area. And what we're hoping is that that will sort of filter down to other companies and also raise awareness among consumers, and that they'll only want to do business with companies that are being socially responsible in this area. And what we're seeing now is that there is federal legislation that's modeled on this innovation. The other things they're doing in California is this year they passed a domestic worker bill of rights law, and what this recognized was the fact that domestic workers are often exempt from minimum wage and other workplace protections. What this does is it makes sure that domestic workers are not being exploited and trying to prevent trafficking from before it happens. Again, sort of looking at how this can be replicated in other states to be providing protection to this extremely vulnerable population. Finally, this year California passed, but unfortunately the bill was vetoed, a law regarding foreign labor recruiting. And this is the practice of recruiters charging fees to workers and then bringing them over where they're placed in exploitative and oftentimes labor trafficking situations. The bill was intended to prevent that from happening and also providing redress for when it does happen. Like I said, unfortunately, the bill was vetoed by the governor, but this is also something we're seeing taken up at the federal level. So in addition to supply chain and foreign labor contracting, both of which are bills that will be introduced or have been introduced on the federal level, another area where the federal law is really focusing that will impact states is looking at the role of the child welfare system as it relates to trafficking. What we've seen in the states and what we've been told from state child welfare agencies is that a lot of identified victims actually had contact with the child welfare system before being trafficked, a lot of them being recruited directly out of that system. So what the federal government has been asking themselves is what role can they play in making sure that that doesn't happen. And so we're seeing a lot of interest and a lot of legislation around that will then filter down into the states. So these are all practices and innovations that we're seeing that states can take up to inform federal policy, or to, the reverse, which is also looking at federal policy and seeing how that can be adopted into the states. You can go to the next slide. So that's really just sort of a brief introduction and overview. If you have any questions or are interested in legislation please feel free to reach out, and we hope to be a resource to you. Thank you so much for your time and for having me speak.
Thank you, Ms. Vanderhoof. This is great information. It's interesting to see some of the innovative things going on in our states. You mentioned Kentucky. Actually, Representative Sandy Overly, who was a sponsor of the legislation there, I'd hoped to be on this call. She had a prior engagement, but I know that if there are any legislative members on the in the audience that want more information on her bill, she's very passionate about the issue, and I know her office would be happy to get you some more information on that legislation. So we'll move immediately to the second presentation. Senator Ervin.
Thank you so much. Again, thank you for allowing me to present. My first slide is just Arkansas and our Human Trafficking Act. If you will just go to the next slide. Next slide is really just, I think, an appropriate title for the journey that we embarked upon in understanding this issue. And I will say that it really started with just a lot of conversation and a lot of understanding and trying to understand what the issue was. And so it was really as a result of the Polaris project, which we worked very, very closely on, and you've heard a wonderful presentation from the Polaris project on the issue as a baseline. But when we received an F on our report card from Polaris project, the state of Arkansas, there were several of us that perked up and understood that. And at the time, I was serving as chair of our Children and Youth Committee in the Senate. And so that report card does catch attention, and it did catch our attention. And so as chair of the Children and Youth Committee, I teamed up with another couple of legislators, and we started to ask, well, why? Why is it this way? And so I called for a committee meeting, and we actually put together our first summit in Arkansas on human trafficking. And we invited the Attorney General's office to participate with us. And as the chair of Children and Youth Committee, I flew in folks from Polaris Project to testify as to why we received that F and what we could do about it. And that really started, I think, what I call our journey in understanding and confronting human trafficking. Was that first annual summit that we threw together, myself and Representative David Meeks from House End and Representative Greg Letting. We just decided we were going to do this. And we also invited, during that first annual summit, we invited members that are advocacy groups to come and testify at that committee meeting seminar. And we also combined with Polaris Project and did workshops the next day. It was kind of a 2-day event. And we did a workshop at a local church for folks that are interested in the issue, and then how they could help and spread the information to either their churches or their communities or law enforcement or whatever. So that actually occurred last year before the regular policy session, which was this past January through May 2013. So this was in 2012, and about June, July, I think it was in June when we held that first summit. And it was just a great turnout. Also during that committee meeting, which was a combined committee meeting between the House and the Senate, we heard from victims of human trafficking as well. So I think that was just a very good initial step for us to raise the awareness with our fellow legislators about what this is and the fact that it does affect children. If you'll get to the next slide, please. Understanding our mission. There I have a picture of myself with this little girl, and we're the Razorbacks. Arkansas is proud of that. But, you know, I just put this in here as just my personal guide marker for how I try to operate as a legislator, and that is listen. I think that as a legislator, that's my number one job, is to listen to citizens. Listen to organizations, listen to all of those surrounding us, and enter into that dialogue. And I think that's the way you are as effective as possible in creating and crafting policy, is just by listening and truly understanding those issues. And I feel extremely strong about the idea that our first and primary responsibility are children. They are kind of the unrepresented majority, I think, a lot of times because they can't vote. They're too young to vote, obviously, and we tend to dismiss policy when it's not a voting bloc, and that sounds horrible, but it's true. I find that a lot of times, and there's not necessarily a lobbying group for children, although there are a lot of folks out there that advocate for them, but politics are politics. So I feel that children are just our priority, and they have been my priority. I am a mother of 4 children, and that's my number one job before being a legislator. So I say when it comes to children, it's important that we do all we can to understand those policies and how they're affected by the policies that we put in place. I also picked this picture because we often think of human trafficking as an issue that doesn't necessarily reside in our neighborhoods of America, but that's absolutely not the case. The lady that I met who is a victim of human trafficking, you'll see later in the presentation, she is blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and she was a victim, and it happened when she was walking from her house to her friend's house in her own neighborhood in Virginia when she was a child. And so we often think that it's only an issue that is dealt with foreign nationals or from folks from other countries, but that's just not the case. It is very much an issue that is occurring right here in our neighborhoods with all types of children, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, African-American, dark-eyed. No matter what it is not a crime that discriminates. It affects all of us. If you'll go to the next slide, please. Why Arkansas? Here you can read this as you're seeing it. This is a very haunting fact, in my opinion, as to the complexity of this crime. It's not just kidnapping. It's not just the sexual exploitation. It's not just what we consider trafficking or transportation. It's also drug addiction. It's also physical violation, but also mental violation, psychological damage. And this really is something that I think speaks to really the just insidious nature of this crime and the lengths that the traffickers will go in order to really benefit financially from somebody. But it is just you'll see there that this did happen in Little Rock, and the FBI did investigate, and we were right in the middle of a huge human trafficking ring in the state of Arkansas. If you'll go to the next slide, here's as a picture, some pictures together. This was from the Catholic Charities of Arkansas information, and there's a brothel in Arkansas that was discovered, and there's some pictures of the types of conditions that are occurring that we find our children in these conditions. A lot of times when you're talking about policy or politics, you'll say follow the money. Well, that's absolutely the case in human trafficking. It's the second largest criminal enterprise in the world, bringing in $32 billion annually. That is going to become more of a problem, I believe, in America as we continue down the path that we're going. And if it's a $32 billion annual industry, you better believe that it's going to become more prevalent, because if there's money to be made, people will fall into that. That is unfortunately the nature of our society. If you'll go to the next slide. This was Arkansas's grade from Polaris Project. 2012, Arkansas ranked in the bottom tier 4 with a score of 2. We had really just passed something that was just in name only of human trafficking, not necessarily anything that had teeth. Which then we did the summit, which I described, and in 2013 this past year. Actually, it was while we were passing the legislation. I think it was actually the day that we voted on our final bills in both the Senate and the House, the comprehensive bill. We actually had a package of 3 bills, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. But it was actually the day that we were voting on these bills in both the House and the Senate. They moved through the system at the same time. We had companion bills, and that exact day was when Polaris Project revealed the results for 2013, and we worked very closely with James Dold, who was there at Polaris, and it was a really monumental day in Arkansas that we were able to do that on that same day. That wasn't planned, but it did happen, and clearly you can see we moved into the top tier with a score of 10.5 and achieved, along with 3 other states, the most improved status in their 2013 annual report, and it was definitely a monumental day. The next slide, building our team. I know I'm assuming that there are some legislators from other states perhaps on this call, but I think it's extremely important to understand this issue and to build a team that reflects our society. And just as I described before, this crime does not discriminate, and it does not pick African American or white, and it doesn't pick men or women. It picks both. It doesn't pick Republicans or Democrats or conservatives or liberals. It picks both. It picks all. And so it's really important for us to combine with folks in different parties to really tackle this legislation. And there's a picture of us in the Senate with my fellow colleague, Senator Joyce Elliott and Senator Jason Rayburn. Senator Elliott had passed the initial human trafficking law in Arkansas, and I want to also say that being a bipartisan team, we all co-sponsored each other's bills, and we had a package of 3 bills. And Senator Elliott was the primary sponsor on our Safe Harbor bill. Representative Greg Letting was the primary sponsor on our bill that dealt with the posting of the national hotline in very similar to what you just heard through the Polaris Project presentation. And then Representative David Meeks had the companion bill in the House, and Jason just supported all of this. But it was important to understand that this really is modern-day slavery. And a lot of times I think that we get pigeonholed in parties that we don't really understand a lot of the issues perhaps that our African American colleagues or African American population really dealt with through slavery. And this really was an opportunity for us, I think, that are Caucasian, to have those conversations with our African American friends and to understand that we now are all victims of what is considered modern-day slavery. And it was a very tender, I think, moment for a lot of us that worked on this team together and joining with our Black caucus in the legislature on this issue. It was a nice recognition, I think, of us that we understand. We now understand, I think, very clearly what your people have experienced, and we are now joining with you because we're experiencing it too, or our children are experiencing it as well now. And so I say that because I think it's very, very important that we recognize that with human trafficking, that it really is modern-day slavery, and it's something that cuts across gender, it cuts across race, it cuts across any of that. The next slide, please. Tackling the legislation, we could not have done this really without the support of Polaris Project and James Dold, who was really our point person in just constant negotiations, I would say, and drafting of the legislation. It took months. After our initial summit we had in June, we just started the work then, and it took that entire time, even working through the session, for us to continue to edit and edit and edit the legislation, because we worked with such a huge group of folks, prosecuting attorneys, Attorney General's Office, Department of Children and Family Service, Department of Human Services, the investigative teams, the Police Association, the Sheriff's Association, so many different Department of Corrections. We had to have physical impact statements on the legislation as it was proceeding, because we are a state in Arkansas that operates under a balanced budget amendment. So we have to balance our budget. So anything that deals with particularly crime or Department of Corrections, and which might result in an increase in criminalization and in jailing, is something that we take very seriously as it affects our bottom line. So it was a long process and took months and months, and you'll look there what we did, and I'll just go through this quickly. The bill, the comprehensive bill, is the one that I sponsored primarily, and first section repealed the previous law, which was just simply a Class A felony, was very brief in its definitions. So we really expanded the definitions to include a lot of what you heard from Polaris Project, which defined trafficking of persons, which defined sexually exploited children, patronizing a victim, and penalties for that. I mean, it enhanced the liability of an organization convicted of an offense that perhaps would house human trafficking. It made prostitution an affirmative defense if they were a victim of human trafficking, as well as sexual solicitation. That's very important as you move forward in this crime, that those folks that are victims of human trafficking can then go to law enforcement with the idea that they're not going to be prosecuted into prostitution, that they were really victims of this. And it created the Human Trafficking Task Force and made the crime a Class Y felony with the inclusion of trafficking of persons, and provided for civil cause of action for victims. And that's just a very brief snapshot of the legislation. And you can find this legislation if you type on to the Arkansas Legislative website and you type in Senate Bill SB 242, which became Act 132. If you'll go to the next slide, please. The significant policy achievements, according to Polaris Project, as a result of this new law, I have listed there. There is a sex trafficking provision, and I get this off of their website, and to give credit to them. The labor trafficking provision is included. Asset forfeiture and or investigative tools are included. We had some difficulties with asset forfeiture in making sure that it was not elevated above other crimes out there, which also dealt with asset forfeiture. So that was a little bit of a roadblock that we faced in making sure that we really wanted to go there a little bit further with asset forfeiture, but realized we would have to amend a lot of other laws to kind of raise them to the same level. Training and or Human Trafficking Task Force, which we have both, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The posting of the Human Trafficking Hotline, Safe Harbor. Posting Human Trafficking Hotline was a separate bill, and I can talk about it. And if you want to write that bill number down, it was House Bill 1581, which became Act 1157, and that was the posting bill. A little bit of a problem, we have dry counties in Arkansas, and a lot of our areas where we serve alcohol that have alcohol permits are family-type restaurants, and so we kind of had to work a little bit through that issue so that we were able to define that a little closely. We also have Safe Harbor law. That was a separate law, and that was Senate Bill 869, which became Act 1257. Protecting minors. The law, and this is one thing that we did face with the Safe Harbor law, was working with DHS and DCFS and limited staff and how we deal with that. We also created a Safe Harbor fund for victims in that and law. But the thing that I think the roadblock we ran into with the Safe Harbor law was just basically the resources we have within Department of Children and Family Services and the ability for them to really deal with the victims in the appropriate way. So we kind of had to reach some compromises there. We also lowered the burden of proof for sex trafficking of minors. There is victim assistance that we put into the law, access to civil damages, and the vacating of convictions for sex trafficking victims. We didn't go far enough with that. We met partial requirements, but obviously there's room for improvement as we move into the 2015 legislative session. The next slide you'll see actually occurred November 19, 2013, just a couple of days ago, was our first task force meeting. The room was full, the media was there, they're actually in the hallway in this picture doing reports, but the Arkansas Attorney General's State Task Force for the Prevention of Human Trafficking. There's over 40 individuals that are appointed to this task force, and just it was a great meeting. I'm very proud that we were able to have, again, bipartisan effort in that we were able to work with the Attorney General's office and really achieve a great working task force that includes folks from Arkansas Children's Hospital, Department of Human Services, Department of Labor, and folks from the Consulate of Mexico in Little Rock are on this task force. All of our law enforcement folks, sheriff's offices, police departments all across the state, the FBI, U.S. ICE, Department of Homeland Security, the folks, all the advocacy groups, PATH, Partners Against Human Trafficking of Humans, Not for Sale campaign. Those are some of the advocacy groups out there for human trafficking. But also folks that are at Mid-South UALR, University of Arkansas, at Little Rock, and higher education folks are also listed on this task force. If the next slide, please. That's a committee list of the Human Trafficking Task Force, and I think that's important to include in my presentation so that there's the legislation which we passed, and that's really a starting point. There's so much training that needs to occur with our law enforcement. I think there's a lot of, in discussions I've had with law enforcement and Prosecuting Attorneys Association, they scratch their head and they think back about different cases that they have prosecuted, and they realize now that that really might have been a case of human trafficking beyond just kidnapping or prostitution or rape or whatever. But at the time, they couldn't prosecute it because it wasn't clearly defined, number one. Number two, it didn't have the penalty that was high enough for them to really go after. So they went after the crime that held the highest level of penalty. So there's a lot of education and understanding what the issue is, how you proceed in prosecuting it, and making sure that you see all the different signs. And so important in the legislation that you combine all of that and give your prosecuting attorneys, your law enforcement, the path to follow in defining that. Because it's not just physically in neighborhoods or in hospitals, it's online. There's a huge internet component to this, which we had to bring in and understand. So public awareness, the establishment of policy on victims, developing a state plan, obviously the coordination, collection, and sharing of information. That's important. I think as we move forward with legislation or changes to legislation, we always want to know the statistics. We always want to know how it's being impacted in our citizens' lives. And if there is going to be a request for additional funds, there's always got to have that information to back up the request for additional funding for whatever it may be. So that's a big part, I think, of the task force moving forward. And then training is key. If you'll go to the next slide, please. This is a really wonderful slide for me. It just shows our governor, Mike Beebe, signing the Human Trafficking Act of 2013. And I'm standing there with Representative David Meeks, who's on the far end. And the three ladies in the middle, two of them are victims of human trafficking. And it was really my friendship that developed with these ladies and understanding what happened to them and listening to their stories that really put me on this path. And so if it hadn't been for these three ladies and just their survival through what is absolutely one of the most horrendous things I've ever known in my life, or stories that I've heard, the fact that they survived this hideous crime and then became advocates that changed the law in Arkansas is just a testimony to their strength, their faith in God, and the fact that they did not want something like what happened to them to happen to other children and other girls and boys. It is just such a testament to our American strength, our American will, and their faith, and I just could not have done it without them. And it was just a monumental day, and there were prayers being lifted up there at the end, and you can see that in this picture, which I really, really love. The final slide is just me. It's just been such a pleasure to be able to present to you, and thank you so much to SLC for the opportunity and just really to understand this issue. If I can be of assistance, my email is there, my phone number is there, and be so glad to answer any questions and to help any legislators out there in the process. I know that I kind of moved through things quickly and covered just the main bill and not the other two, but if I can be of any assistance, just please do not hesitate to call me at all. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Senator. Excellent presentation. Great information on the bill there in Arkansas. We applaud your efforts there, and I think a great point about the ubiquitous nature of this crime and how important it is to work together across party lines and so forth to combat it. So we'll move to the final presentation. Ms. Racine, I know we're running a little bit behind, but I know you've got some great information for us, so please take as much time as you need, and we look forward to your remarks.
Great, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Dahlia Racine. I am an assistant district attorney in DeKalb County, Georgia. We are just east of city of Atlanta, actually incorporate some of the city within our jurisdiction. So I guess I wanted to give you a different perspective, kind of once these laws are enacted, what does it look like regarding the enforcement? What does our problem look like? So if you could go to the next slide. A lot of times, of course, we use acronyms because sometimes we just get too lazy to say the whole thing out. But a common acronym that we use is CSEC. So what is CSEC? CSEC is the commercial sexual exploitation of children, and what it is, it exists under the umbrella of human trafficking. You've heard the presenters before me state that, oftentimes when you first hear human trafficking, you think of movies just like that, like Traffic or whatever, that it's an international problem. But the reality is that it's a domestic problem, that most of the children being exploited here in the U.S. are domestic. They are from here. But CSEC is dealing just with the minors and just dealing with sexual exploitation. We're not talking about not talking about the domestic or dealing with the labor, the labor portion of it. We're just talking about the sexual portion and with minors. If you could go to the next slide. So what does it look like? What types of CSEC are out there? We have various types. It's going to be street prostitution, pornography, stripping, internet-based exploitation, which we'll talk about in a little bit, private parties, sex lines, gang-based prostitution. This is where we're seeing a lot of growth in this area, unfortunately, is with the gangs that are going and turning to selling children in addition to drugs and guns and whatever else based on how lucrative it is. Interfamilial pimping, we're seeing this. This isn't just necessarily some disinterested party selling a child. Sometimes we're seeing family members selling each other to pay the bills, to pay the rent, to pay whatever type of debt they may have to, say, their drug dealer or whoever it may be, and selling their children in exchange for those obligations they may have. You can go to the next slide. So here in Georgia, we knew that we had a problem and tried to quantify it, and what we saw after commissioning a study was that 300 to 500 girls each month are commercially sexually exploited in the state of Georgia. That's a huge number, and if you could just click to get those bullet points up, that would be perfect, and you could just get them all up. As far as looking at the demand side, which was very important for us here in Georgia, we saw that 7,200 men per month were purchasing adolescent girls in Georgia. What they did was they set up a fake escort line, and what they had was men call in, and when the men would call in, they gave 3 progressive warnings regarding the children, saying, the first one saying, hey, we think that she might be underage, the next one saying, we're pretty sure she's underage, and then the final one being, we're certain that this child is underage. 47% of the men who called in still went through with that purchase, even after those 3 progressive warnings. So what we saw was that this wasn't necessarily just a pedophile that was trying to purchase children. This was men driven by an attempt to purchase sex, and the fact that it was a juvenile did not deter them. If you could go to the next slide, please. So what we were seeing was, how is it that the children were being sold? And that was important to kind of see where we needed to combat the problem. What you could see from the chart is that, you know, what we traditionally think of the street activity or things along those lines, or the hotel lobbies or the escort services, is pretty much leveling out as far as their contribution to this issue. However, what we saw was a huge response, obviously, from the Internet, along with everything else in the world, is going to the Internet. And so what we saw was that this reigned true with human trafficking as well. You could see on the chart that around February of 2010 there appears to be a bit of a drop, and we would like to think that we were really just kind of resilient in our efforts. However, the cause of that drop was because in February of 2010, Craigslist shut down their erotic services section, and so where we had a main source for law enforcement to track where these things were going on, that then went away, and about 55 million other websites, yes, I'm exaggerating, I know, but not much, I'm sure. Tons of other websites opened up and operated to then start exploiting and selling children. And so instead of having a centralized location to go to before, now they're kind of scattered, and so it's harder to find and detect. If you could go to the next slide. And what the next slide is showing is just simply that pretty much, like I said, along with everything else, and like the Senator said earlier, this issue is going to the Internet. And it's not only the selling of the children that's going to the Internet, it's the recruiting. The studies are showing that Facebook and other social media is the #1 recruitment tool of exploiters to get to children. If you go to the next slide. So you hear that we talk a lot of times about girls, and this is, you know, that a majority of the cases that even I'm making are dealing with girls. But we have to ask, is there a boy problem too? And if you could just click to get those bullet points. There was a study by ECPAT, which is a group that in child prostitution and trafficking. They commissioned a study to see if there was a boy problem out there. And what they found was surprising, shocking when I read it. As high as 50% of CSEC children in the U.S. are boys. What that says to me, being involved in law enforcement, being a prosecutor, is that we are totally missing the mark. If all of my cases involve females, why am I not able to find the boys? If you could just go to the next slide. What we're seeing is that the boys who are victimized, that they have the same issues as the girls. There's high rates of child sexual abuse. There's actually higher rates of street sexual victimization. What that means is that these boys who are involved in the life, they're getting brutally beaten while they're out there. It's not just about the sexual act. It's about the violence that's behind that. If you could get the other bullet points as well, please. Boys enter the sex trade to meet their basic needs. This means that they're hungry. They have nowhere to stay. They don't have any money. There's a disproportionately high use of drugs. A majority of CSEC boys are heterosexual. There's all these stereotypes of this willingness that is, you know, raging hormones or something along those lines. It is completely erroneous. These are boys that are being totally victimized. And if you look, the average age of entry for a boy, 11 to 13 years old. It's just shocking. If you could go to the next one. And so when you try to think of, well, how is this even a problem, and why is this happening, you know, sure it's not happening in my area, which is often what we hear when we try to present these trainings around the state and around the country. But for those of you who are familiar with the Georgia area, Douglas County, which is actually where I reside, is a suburb of the city of Atlanta. And in Douglas County, they had a boy case. If you could go to the next slide. In that case, it was 2 men who were held responsible for a ring of boys that were being trafficked during that time. They came from all over, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, and they were trafficked across state lines. They did receive, one of the traffickers received at least 14 years in prison for that offense. If you go to the next slide. So why do we have such a big problem in the Atlanta area? Well, the issue is that we have, number one, the world's busiest airport. We have major highways. We have the highest number of strip clubs per capita, large hotels, all sorts of things that kind of create and contribute to the cesspool that is the human trafficking industry. However, what we also see is that, if you could go to the next slide, when we go to areas outside of the direct city, and whatever areas you may be from, whether they're rural, whether they're urban, what we see is that the demand for this issue is coming from all over states. So yes, maybe some of the acts are occurring more so in the city, in the condensed areas, but where the demand is coming from is from all over the states. If you could put up those bullet points. Majority of men responsible for CSEC come from outside of Atlanta and Georgia. Men place orders from all over Georgia for these children. About half of them prefer for the girls to come to his location. And 15 to 20% of Georgia escort services cater to men outside of the metro area. If you go to the next slide. So why is this such a big problem? I think, quite honestly, it's one of those things, like the senator was saying, that, you know, she's talked to plenty of law enforcement and they hear about it and then they think back. You know, there's part of it, it's very easy to go undetected, in the sense that, you know, if we have a car that we suspect that there's drugs in it, you call out the drug dogs, they alert, and that's fine. We have our PC, we go forward. But when you have 14 to 15-year-old girls in the car and the exploiter says, oh, these are my cousins, you know, what other remedies do we have? So there's a confidence in the criminal component of this to say, hey, you know, first off, law enforcement's not really aware of it. Number two, it's so easy for me to hide. And for us, it takes that extra component of training law enforcement. Ask those additional questions. Separate them. See what's going on. It's a renewable resource. These children can be sold night after night, time after time. A kilo of cocaine and AK-47, they can only be sold one time. These girls, these boys, these children can be sold time and time and time again. The access to the supply. The number one indicator of a child that will be brought into the life, which is the term for CSEC, is going to be that they're a runaway. There is no end of supply of runaways, so there's constantly going to be feeding into this system. And then, of course, there's a high demand. Men are not going to want to stop having sex, so there's always going to be the demand, and the supply then feeds into it. And it's lucrative. Studies show that, on average, a girl can bring in $100,000 a year to their exploiter. If you go to the next slide. And it's common that these exploiters will have more than one child working for them at a time. On the next slide, just talking about, if you could put up those bullet points, that we have to fight our own stereotypes. What we see is that these victims don't choose prostitution. That's often what we think, that the average age of entry for females is 12 to 14 years old. Like I said before, overwhelming number are runaways. 70 to 90% have been sexually abused. What that means is that they've already been groomed for this. So if there's a child who may have at some point been abused by her stepfather, where every other night she gets raped by her stepfather, well, at least when she's with her exploiter, with her pimp, she knows when it's going to happen. At least he'll do her hair and do her nails. Or at least she doesn't have to deal with the issues that may be at home, because most of them are coming from a troubled home, where, say, a parent is addicted to some type of drugs. And you know what? The child knows, at least I know that when I'm with my pimp, that I'll only get beat if I don't bring in enough money. But with my mom, when she's strung out on coke or crack, I don't know when she's going to beat me. She just comes in and she just lets it out on me. So you have to understand, what are these children's choices when they're going into the life. If you go to the next slide. And so Dallas Police Department has been phenomenal in their efforts as to combating and dealing with this issue. And what they did was they tracked their runaways and tracked the girls that they confirmed that had been involved in prostitution, and kind of looked at what those common factors. Again, the history of runaway being a huge issue, truancy, prior sexual abuse, school suspension, parental abandonment, parental criminal history, prior pregnancy, just all sorts of things that were an issue within their family. If you go to the next one. So the other thing that we had to deal with is what our own society standards were and our perceptions, if you will, when it came to this issue. And so, yes, we have the laws in place. But what we have to also do is look at what our own analysis, what our own perceptions are regarding this entire topic. So if we look about it, the reality is that as a society, we glorify pimps. We still do. You could see that you could go to any mall across the U.S. and pick up a pimp cup. You can go to around Halloween. If anybody was out and about, you see how many people in a pimp costume or see how easy it is to buy one for a child. The term pimp is a term of endearment. You could see the baby onesie, playground pimp. There was a series, Pimps Up, Hose Down, that was received all sorts of recognition on HBO. And if you think about like all the songs are out there, the shows are out there, Pimp My Ride, it's a term of endearment. It's not an insult for somebody to be called a pimp. If you could go to the next slide. However, when you think about how are the girls perceived, how are the children who are involved in this industry, how are they looked upon, even by those who maybe are charged with being in law enforcement, charged with protecting children, charged, working in the industry of education. You look at some of these children who you feel are maybe possibly involved in this, and you look down on them. These are lyrics from a song by 50 Cent called PIMP. It was out several years ago. This was being played on radios all across the U.S. And if you look at the terms, the way that these girls are referred to, just kind of how there's no regard. And the girls perceive this, these children perceive this, that people don't care about me. And when that is confirmed by the way that we as society react to them when we encounter them or when we're dealing with them, then that's just kind of, it reaffirms everything their pimp tells them, that nobody cares about you, which is why they get trapped in the life. If you could go to the next slide. So what we decided in Georgia that we had to do was adopted House Bill 200, and that was back in 2011. Which we did was we modeled a lot of the federal law, but also, if you could go to the next slide, also kind of added a couple things of our own. You heard the prior speakers just talk about some of those things that were important to have in our laws. And so what we did was we limited the defense of traffickers. They couldn't say, well, she was out on the streets and prostituting before I met her, or that's my girlfriend. Or in Georgia, what we have is that for trafficking, it's under the age of 18. The age of consent in Georgia is 16. So we had to deal with that little window frame of the 16 to 18-year-old. So the fact that she is of age to consent would not be a defense for the trafficker. The fact that he didn't know her age would not be a defense. We do have the affirmative defense because here in the state of Georgia, children can still be charged with prostitution, but they now have the provision that they can have the affirmative defense if they are being trafficked. We are, however, seeing that in our juvenile courts that this is not really being pursued very much. Most of these children are not being pushed into these prostitution charges, and if they are, then there's a lot of alternative sentencing and wraparound services that are being provided. We do have the coercion and deception prongs that were discussed earlier. We did tie in the RICO statutes. We increased the penalties depending on age, and also we're doing things with training law enforcement, and our Georgia Bureau of Investigation has also been given jurisdiction to investigate these types of cases. Why that was important is because we have some smaller jurisdictions that were not familiar with the topic, that didn't kind of know what to do when they stumbled upon one of these cases, so now they have a team in place that they just need to be called in if they do suspect that they have a CSEC case present. If you go to the next slide. Next is just what our trafficking statute is here in Georgia. I just wanted to show you all that real quick, that what we have come up with for trafficking is the same thing that was stated earlier about knowingly recruiting, enticing, harboring, transports, obtains, or maintains a child for the purposes of labor or sexual servitude. If you could actually skip through the next few slides to go to the one with the big question mark regarding other related charges, that will be perfect. And basically, these were just several charges that we use in our arsenal when it comes to dealing with these CSEC cases: pimping, pandering, keeping a place of prostitution, sexual exploitation of children, which would be basically our child pornography statute, because that's important for us. basically because, like I said, children are being sold on the internet, and the internet is a marketing tool, so therefore you need photographs of the goods. And so what we see in most of our cases is that these girls are being photographed nude, sexually compromising positions, and so we're charging them with that, as well as cruelty to children, simply because it is obviously very cruel for these children to go through these things. If you could go to the next slide. We also have several other charges that we consider when prosecuting a CSEC offense. It can go from kidnapping to organized crime to false ID, and we've been pretty successful. We have issues with initially having to educate not only our judges but our juries as to what this really means, on top of law enforcement as well. But we've seen sentences from 60 years all the way up to 3 life sentences on several individuals. Do we get some cases where judges still are kind of cutting what our sentence recommendations are? Of course, but we're getting there. We're working and we're making progress, and that's from the efforts of the individuals that you've heard today in promoting these laws and allowing us to have these tools when we go after these pimps. Last slide. So I like to be solution-based in my presentations, and if for those of you, whatever various areas you may deal with, a lot of times after hearing this information, it's kind of like, well, what can I do? Well, number one is educate yourself and others. Talk to your legislators. There may be some on this call listening in other than Senator Irving, but talk to them. Let them know that this is important. Let them know that this topic is something that deserves their attention. Volunteer. There are so many different organizations that have made this their mission in dealing with this issue. And then one of the most important things is that we can no longer kind of hide our heads in the sand about this. If you see something, if something rings to you that says, hey, this just doesn't feel right, whatever I'm seeing, this child with this man or this child with this woman, say something. That's one of the biggest things that we could do. And if you're looking for ways to deal with this, don't be overwhelmed. It can absolutely be overwhelming when you're saying, what does my response need to be to CSEC, to human trafficking? But just know there are so many others just like you with that sentiment. And the most important thing you can do is collaborate. Go out there, find others that are like-minded. Everybody has different skill sets and services to bring to this issue, and contribute that to them. So thank you all very much for your time and attention. And again, if there are any questions, feel free to contact me. I apologize I don't have a final slide with my contact information, but it should be on the website. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ms. Racine. Great presentation. Excellent information, digging down into the enforcement aspect of this, and I think some great points about the societal or even cultural nuances of this problem. Thanks for that. Thanks for that information. We've run out of time, but there is a quick question I think that I could answer quickly. It was just to repeat the name of the legislator in Kentucky who sponsored the human trafficking bill. That was Representative Sandy Overly. And I think you can find her contact information on the web, or I'd be happy to send it to you. And actually, on that note, I was going to mention quickly that another one of our southern states, Mississippi, I believe, made it into the most improved Polaris project rankings, and Representative Larry Byrd there in Mississippi sponsored that bill. Again, great bipartisan support in both of those states, and I know either of their offices would be happy to speak to you if you want some more information on their bills or the process in getting those passed. So to close, I'd like to thank all our panelists for excellent presentations. We appreciate their taking time and work putting this information together, and for taking time this afternoon to share it with us. Again, just a reminder that if you know somebody who was unable to join us, or if you wish to return to some of the information presented today, the webinar will be available at the CSG's Knowledge Center. That's Knowledge Center spelled out, knowledgecenter.csg.org, probably by the middle of next week. We post these events as YouTube videos, which include obviously the audio, but also the PowerPoint slides. So they're very accessible. You can easily forward them along, email them, and you can essentially revisit any portion of the webinar through CSG's Knowledge Center. Before we close, I wanted to thank the audience for joining us this afternoon. I hope you found the information useful. And again, if you have any subsequent questions that maybe you didn't think about, something comes up later, please don't hesitate to send those along to me at jlwilliams@csg.org. That's jlwilliams@csg.org. I'd also like to say a quick thanks to Carrie Abner and the other CSG staff for their technical support, as well as their assistance in advertising and helping to organize this event. We really appreciate all the work you all put in behind the scenes. Thanks again to our presenters and to everyone for joining us. Have a pleasant afternoon.